As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So U.S. Central Command said that it launched more missile strikes against the Houthis in Yemen early Wednesday morning, marking the 9th time that the U.S. bombed Yemen since January 12th. CENTCOM said that the Houthis, quote, fired 3 anti-ship ballistic missiles from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen toward the U.S. flagged, owned, and operated container ship motor vessel Maersk Detroit, which was transiting the Gulf of Aden, end quote. The command said that 1 missile landed in the water and the other 2 were intercepted by a U.S. Navy warship, so they're not saying the ship was hit. So later in the day, the Houthis said that their forces engaged in a 2-hour battle with several U.S. warships. A Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sarriah claimed the confrontation resulted in a Houthi missile directly hitting an American warship, but so far I haven't seen any confirmation of that from the U.S. side. A bipartisan group of senators has sent a letter to President Biden questioning his legal authority to launch a new war against the Houthis in Yemen, and they also questioned the overall strategy of the campaign. So this letter was signed by Senators Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, Mike Lee from Utah, Republican, and Todd Young from Indiana, also a Republican. The letter reads, quote, the Constitution requires that the United States not engage in military action absent a favorable vote of Congress. There is no current congressional authorization for offensive U.S. military action against the Houthis, end quote. The senators noted that the Biden administration has acknowledged the strikes on Yemen would not deter the Houthis. This seems like they're referring to what President Biden said. The letter reads, quote, the administration has stated that the strikes on Houthi targets to date have not and will not deter the Houthi attacks, suggesting that we are in the midst of an ongoing regional conflict that carries the risk of escalation, end quote. The senators said that an argument could be made to justify strikes in defense of U.S. commercial shipping, but they noted that most ships that go through the Red Sea are not American. And again, before Biden started bombing the Houthis, they were not targeting American commercial shipping. The senators asked, quote, does your administration believe there is a legal rationale for a president to unilaterally direct U.S. military action to defend ships of foreign nations, end quote. The letter asked why Biden has only submitted 1 notification about bombing Yemen under the 1973 War Powers Act, as there has been multiple rounds of strikes, and they asked how the administration understands the term self-defense in the context of this new campaign. That's how somehow they're calling these self-defense strikes. And Congress has previously challenged, unfortunately, it seems like overall in the Senate and the House, the Congress is supportive of this new war. Not a surprise. But Congress has previously challenged the executive branch's authority to wage war in Yemen. Back in 2019, they passed a war powers resolution that would have ended U.S. involvement in the Saudi war against the Houthis, which included intelligence support, maintenance of their planes, all sorts of support that the Saudis really relied on for what they were doing. And that was passed by both chambers in 2019. It was a huge deal, but unfortunately it was vetoed by President Trump. So Russia said on Wednesday that Ukrainian forces shot down a Russian military transport plane over Russia's Belgorod Oblast, killing all 74 people on board, including 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that its forces registered 2 anti-aircraft missiles fired from Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast, which borders Belgorod, and they say these missiles hit the aircraft, which is an Il-76 Russian military plane. The ministry claimed that the POWs were being transported as part of a planned prisoner swap with Ukraine. So Ukraine has not officially confirmed or denied responsibility for downing the plane, but sources told Ukrainska Pravda that Ukrainian forces were responsible. The Ukrainian military also hinted that it was behind the incident. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said in a statement that it would, quote, continue to destroy the means of delivery and control the airspace to eliminate the terrorist threat, including on the Belgorod-Kharkiv front, end quote. Ukraine's military intelligence acknowledged in a statement that a prisoner swap was scheduled to take place on Wednesday, but said it had no information about who was on board the downed Russian plane. The statement said, quote, a prisoner exchange was to have taken place today, but did not. According to the Russian side, this was a result of the shooting down of a Russian Il-76 plane, which was allegedly transporting our prisoners. We currently have no reliable and comprehensive information about who was on board the aircraft and in what numbers, end quote. And it's unclear what kind of missiles were used to shoot down this plane, which was hit about 55 miles inside Russia. The head of Russia's State Duma, sorry, not the head of the State Duma, this is one of their houses of parliament. The head of the State Duma's Defense Committee suggested that Ukrainian forces could have used the U.S.-made Patriot missiles or the German-made Iris-10 air defense system. So it seems pretty clear that Ukraine shot down this plane based on the comments. And I saw Zelensky later in the day kind of said there should be an investigation and not really denying it. So it seems pretty clear that the Ukrainians shot down this plane and killed the Ukrainian POWs who were on board.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You have an article that's coming out tomorrow, and it's called Government by Experts. You go on to say, I've often thought that after Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson was our worst president. By worst is meant least faithful to the Constitution and most destructive of personal liberty. With the exception of Lincoln's dictatorship, during which the federal government used violence to crush the state's natural right to secede from the Union they had voluntarily joined, and instead brought about the systemic murder of 750,000 persons. America, from its founding to the early part of the 20th century, more or less enjoyed the James Madison model for the federal government. Judge, what you just wrote here, why, you must hate Lincoln. You probably like slavery. How do I, And
that's what they say when I make that argument.
Yeah, the idiots, the people that swallow they're still in kindergarten, listening to the kindergarten teacher.
Right. The kindergarten teacher told them Lincoln freed the slaves, and therefore the slaughter of Southern and Northern troops was worth it. It's such a farce. The Madisonian model of government, which, with the exception of the Civil War years, we enjoyed, was that the federal government can only regulate and spend in the 16 discrete areas delegated to it by the Constitution. It was a limited government that stayed out of your face, and it stayed out of the faces of the states. When Woodrow Wilson came along, he flipped that on its head, and we have had the Wilsonian model of government since Wilson was president. And that's the opposite of the Madisonian model. Madisonian model, limited to the 16 powers given to the Congress under the Constitution. Wilsonian model, the federal government can regulate any behavior, tax any event, intrude itself into any process, so long as there is no specific prohibition on doing so in the Constitution. So it's the opposite of Madison. And one of the monstrosities that Wilson created, most Americans don't know this, Gerald. Your audience and my audience know this because we talk about it. One of the monstrosities Wilson created under his model of government is the administrative state, the fourth branch of government. It writes its own rules, it interprets its own rules, it enforces its own rules, it punishes its own victims, totally independent of the other three branches of government. Is it in the Constitution? No, it's not. What's an example of it? The Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Administration, the National Marine Fisheries Service. Who the hell has ever heard of that? Well, the National Marine Fisheries Service dictated a rule that you can only take so many herring and so many lobsters from the sea. And in order to enforce that they put a federal agent on every boat and every lobster and herring boat. And then they sent a bill to the owner of the boat for the salary of the federal agent. Well, enough was enough for these fishermen, and they challenged it. It went to a kangaroo court called the administrative court, where the judge works for the same boss that the agency prosecutor does, the Secretary of Commerce. And of course, the judge and the Secretary of Commerce ratified their own rule. By the time this got to the Supreme Court ripped this thing apart in oral argument last week and may very well change the law, which says administrative agencies are not entitled to deference by the court, and the court can examine why they do what they do, because under the Constitution, only the Congress can write these laws. If Congress wants to say X number of lobsters, X pounds of herring, in my opinion, that would be wrong, but it would be constitutional. But when some other entity in the government does that, that's not transparent, that is not answerable to the voters, that makes up its own rules, that claims it has expertise, and the court says defer to them, that's wrong. In my opinion, after that oral argument last week, all of that is going to change.
So what happened to these guys, the lobster guys?
Well, the case was argued before the Supreme Court last week. We won't have an answer until April, but I read the transcript of the oral argument, and it's pretty clear to me that the court is going to not only reverse this crazy rule, it's going to say when an administrative agency writes its own rule, there is no judicial deference to the agency. Right now, there's something called the Chevron doctrine. It's named after a case involving Chevron oil. And it basically says when an administrative agency writes a rule, because they're experts, back to Woodrow Wilson, government by experts, because they're experts, because they know more about what they're writing about, lobster and herring from the sea, parts per billion of a pollutant in the atmosphere. The courts cannot second guess them, and the courts must defer to them. That's the Chevron doctrine. If the court gets rid of the Chevron doctrine and there's no judicial deference to administrative agency, then the administrative agency and the challenger are equal in court. So right now, you go into court. The administrative agency doesn't have to prove its case. The challenger has to disprove the government's case. That's absurd. That's the way it is, or was, in the Soviet Union. Even in Russia, the government is equal to the challenger. So I think this is going to change. Most Americans don't know about this, and it's going to take the teeth out of these administrative agencies who've been regulating us to death. It's also going to say to Congress, hey, you want to write it? You want a law? You write it, and you justify that law to the voters. You don't give it to some secret behind the doors group to write the law so that you don't have to take the heat for it. Whatever government can do to enhance its power and wealth, and if things can get away with, it will do.
And that's the people aren't fighting.
Right.
The fight is gone.
Right. But
You
and I do our best to bring that fight back. Both of our podcasts present a substantially alternate point of view. I mean, the point of view that we present, you don't see in New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, where I was for 24 years. You don't see it anywhere.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
So we are aware of the court decision. We have discussed it with the Prime Minister, with cabinet colleagues, with senior federal government officials and experts. We respect very much Canada's independent judiciary. However, we do not agree with this decision, and respectfully, we will be appealing it. I would just like to take a moment to remind Canadians of how serious the situation was in our country when we took that decision. The public safety of Canadians was under threat. Our national security, which includes our national economic security, was under threat. It was a hard decision to take. We took it very seriously after a lot of hard work, after a lot of careful deliberation. We were convinced at the time, I was convinced at the time, it was the right thing to do. It was the necessary thing to do. I remain, and we remain, convinced of that.
That is a chilling response to being told that what you did was against your own people's human rights. And you go, I just want to be very clear. We thought about this very seriously. We really reflected upon it. We looked at the circumstances, and I was convinced at the time that it was the right thing to do. And I am still convinced that it was the right thing to do. Violating the human rights of the Canadian people, even after years have passed, even after everything you know about COVID and what it amounted to and the risk factors and everything else, still, even after the Supreme Court says you can't do this to your people, we're still certain that what we did was the right path to take. Oh, get the fuck out of Canada, y'all. Get the fuck out of there. Or at least vote these people out. I don't know how your system works. Ask them politely to leave. I think in Canada, by law, if you ask nicely enough, they have to. So just do that. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking shit to Canadians. I love you guys. I know many of you are awesome base savages, so I'm giving her a hard time more than you. But man, that is creepy. That is really creepy, especially with that, I don't know, that lefty speak, just, very, very measured, very, politically correct, of course. Have to say it, long pregnant pauses. And we thought about this deeply. And at the end of the day, our decision to become tyrants was good and proper. And in hindsight, still think so. And we're going to appeal because we'd like to do it to you again. Horrifying people. I mean, whoa.
People freaked out. The whole scientific world did around 2012. 2014 to 16, they banned it. But during this period of time, Anthony Fauci continued to give exemptions to it. But here's the curious thing. The research in Wuhan is going on during this time. We've been funding research in China for a long time, but we keep funding it during the ban. But we can't find records of how they got the exemption. We know it had to go through Anthony Fauci. He says approved all of this research. We can't find it. They won't give us the deliberations. They also set up a committee in 2017. They secretly reopened the door. No more ban, but there was a new committee, a pandemic safety committee that was supposed to review this. There's no way this research shouldn't have gone before the committee. And it didn't go before the committee. All of a sudden, it just, boom, it was getting done. So for 3 years, I've been asking, I want to see the deliberations that happened at the NIH. None of this is classified. It's just science research. It's now 5 years old. I want to see the deliberations on how you made and who made the decision to fund the research in China. But I still can't get it. So there's an elaborate cover-up. So I became intrigued in this. The first year, 2020, I was skeptical of Fauci. I told him he was stupid to close the schools. I opposed him on everything from the beginning. I opposed the lockdowns. I opposed the bailouts. I was the only one on the Senate floor. I went back after I recovered from COVID and said no loudly. It was a voice vote. I was the only no on all that stupid stuff where people stole hundreds of billions of dollars. Dead people got $1 billion of COVID money. I was the only no on the Senate floor. But as I was opposing this, I became intrigued as the 6 months to a year when I was like, wow, I read this article by Nicholas Wade on Medium.com.
Yes.
Once again, he was banned from everything. He used to be a New York Times writer, banned everywhere. I read this like 25-page story, and I'm like, oh my God, they created this in a lab. And I began investigating this and became intrigued by it. But then what really got me to write the book was I saw this exchange of emails between Anthony Fauci on January 31st, feeding into February 1st of 2020. They start about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's a crescendo. And as you read something, even if it's not stated in words, you can feel the tension build. You can feel his fear build, and you can see his heart clenching up like this. The last email's at 3 in the morning. And at 3 in the morning, he emails a guy named Bob Cadillac. I didn't know who Bob Cadillac was. Other people knew him, but I didn't know who he was. And then, Bob, I'm sending this article here, sort of in the middle ground, but it was an article basically saying, nothing to see here. This came from Nature, not the lab. At 3 in the morning. He can't sleep at 3 in the morning. About a year later, we're now 2 years into this, I meet Bob Cadillac, and he was working for the Senate committee, the Republicans, doing a report on the origins of the virus. And I said, Bob, why'd you get that email? And he says, well, I was in charge of the safety committee, the pandemic committee that should have reviewed the Wuhan. And he didn't say this, but my implication is he's sending him an email because he's going to discover that the research that caused the virus was supposed to go before his committee, and he never saw it. So as things come together, to me, it is the greatest cover-up in our history. 1 million people died in the United States, maybe 20 million, 10, 15, 20 million worldwide. And it was funded by government, approved by Anthony Fauci, and then the cover-up. And there's a lot more in the book. We go through all the different articles, the scientific articles in Nature and in Lancet, where they came together and they lied. The people all said it was a conspiracy theory, but they didn't reveal that they were receiving money in this.
A lot of this we already know because you've been listening to me for years. So I guess I'm just playing it to confirm our worst fears. But what I think is remarkable about it is that, Fauci continues to walk around unmolested. No investigations, no prosecution, no nothing.
How do we get him to quit spending? Because I think that, if we don't change this attitude, the appetite for spending by the people, if you don't have fiat money that monetizes the debt, I don't see how, technically, if you go to the Congress and say, do this, do that, the pressures are there. It's automatic by human nature, and the warmongers, they're going to spend the money. So it seems like the technical approach, and I think Reaganomics and supply-side economics was a technical thing that more or less was not going to work if you didn't change the people.
Yeah, well, I would say maybe there's 4 slogans I would use. 1, bring the empire home. 2, shackle the Fed. 3, balance the budget. And 4th, start observing the Constitution once again and distribute the powers of government that are legitimate among all 3 levels of government, not centralize and concentrate everything in Washington. Now, if someone challenged those principles, I would say, 1, they're pretty well based on history. And secondly, they're based on some big lessons that we learned during the Reagan era. He failed to shrink the Leviathan on the Potomac, even as he wanted to very much, because unfortunately he was a small government man domestically, but when it came to the Pentagon side of the Potomac, he was the biggest spender that ever came down the pike. And so what happened was there was a huge defense buildup during those 8 years. We went from Jimmy Carter's already bloated defense budget of $140 billion to $350 billion within 8 years. Almost a tripling of the defense budget. We didn't need that. The Soviet Union was on its last leg anyway, and quickly and very soon thereafter fell apart. It was due to the fact that communism doesn't work, that centralized command and control economies fail, not because Washington was wasting a huge amount of money on defense. Most of that money ended up going not into strategic weapons anyway, but into building up the conventional forces, new tanks, 600 ship Navy, more planes and helicopters and other, defense weaponry than you can imagine. None of that was really needed to combat the Soviet Union, because before the decade was over, it was gone. But once it was put into being, once it was funded, procured, and put into operation, it was a easy way for presidents to be tempted to intervene in conflicts and occupy nations all over the planet. And rather than, when the Cold War ended, bringing the empire home, closing the bases, and getting back to kind of a Fortress America defense, which is all we needed, that huge Reagan buildup became available for presidents of both parties to launch these forever wars and get us into the mess we're in today.
As you say, Dave, I mean, what happened is you had people like Madeleine Albright who famously said, well, what's the use of having this great military if we don't use it?
Exactly.
So when you have it.
And the point there, Daniel, is that she wouldn't have been able to ask that question or do that if it hadn't been put into being in the 80s. If they had to go, if Bush, the senior Bush, or Clinton had to go to the Congress for huge increases in defense spending and taxes to go with it in order to expand NATO, when we promised Gorbachev that we wouldn't, and to intervene multiple times in the Middle East, with the wars in Iraq, twice, Libya, all the rest of them. None of this, in my view, would have happened because the military means wouldn't have been there. So it had a pretty unfortunate, long-lasting legacy. So the lesson we learned is you got to bring the empire home, smash the defense budget, and then get the Fed out of the business of monetizing the public debt. And that's another big reason why Trump is not the answer to our problems. He spent 4 years harassing the Fed, demanding even lower interest rates, which were already practically zero, complaining when they tried to begin shrinking their, bloated balance sheet, which had gotten to $4.5 trillion, basically push the Fed into an even more dangerous, reckless inflationary policy.
Wrote about the folly of President Biden's dust up with the Houthis. You said, I think it was a week or so ago at least, that this is not going to work. This is a disaster. Well, Congress has not been involved at all. You're finally seeing some people waking up in the Senate saying, what the heck is going on? Yesterday was an amazing event, which is that the U.S. Navy attempted to escort two Maersk shipping ships with military equipment on it for Israel. The Houthis, even after 9 bombings, they launched an attack on it, and not only did the ships turn around and go back, but the U.S. Navy turned around and went back. Something tells me, David, that this is not going as they had hoped. What is your take on how things are going there?
Well, it's not going as anyone would hope. We shouldn't be there. The Red Sea is not a pond in our backyard that we need to safeguard and monitor. If because of the fallout and the conflict between the Arab states and countries aligned with Iran and Israel at the moment, the Red Sea, Suez Channel of trade is disrupted, well, that's 6,000 miles from China to Europe. If they have to go around the Cape of Africa, that's 9,000. It's a little bit extra cost, and it's not our job to be the policeman of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. We shouldn't have any of the forces that are there now in harm's way. The one thing that Trump did try to do, but it was basically get us out of some of these situations in the Middle East. But when it came even to Syria, which was ridiculous, why do we still have forces in Syria? Several thousand. He couldn't even get that done because even though he ordered it to be done, nobody paid attention to what he was saying. So now they're there. This conflict is going on. They're sitting ducks to be attacked. And then you have the usual suspects in Washington saying, well, we got to retaliate because, Americans are being harmed. Well, when you put yourself in harm's way, you're going to be harmed. And the answer, the answer is not to escalate the conflict. The answer is to get the hell out of there.